The dog kept staring at the back door. I had been house-sitting for the Mercer family for 3 days by then, and Biscuit was a calm dog, the kind that slept 16 hours and barely lifted his head when I walked in. So when I noticed him standing perfectly still in the kitchen doorway, facing the back of the house, I figured a raccoon had gotten into the yard again. I set down my book and went to look. Nothing out there. The motion light had not tripped. The yard was dark and the fence was closed, and the bird bath in the center of the grass sat exactly as it always did. I went back to my book. About an hour later, I heard a door close somewhere deeper in the house. A soft click, like someone being careful. I told myself it was the house settling, one of those old wood sounds that older homes make at night. I even laughed a little out loud to hear myself laugh. But Biscuit had not moved from the doorway. I did a walk through. Checked every room, every closet, the basement. All the windows were locked. The back door was still bolted from the inside. There was genuinely nothing there. I sat back down on the couch, and that is when I noticed the armchair across from me. There was an indent in the cushion, the kind a person leaves after sitting for a while. I had not sat there once in 3 days. I had barely gone near it. I texted Carol Mercer to ask if anyone else had a key to the house. She said no, then asked why, then said we should have mentioned. Our son stays there sometimes. He does not always let us know. They do not have a son. Our next story. My aunt had been dead 3 weeks when I found the chair moved. I was staying at her place in Creel, a small town in Chihuahua where the nearest neighbor is a good quarter-mile through scrub pine. The house smelled like her, like cedar and old paper, and I had been working through her closets for 4 days without incident. Practical work. Sorting things into boxes. The kind of grief that keeps your hands busy. That evening I set a dining chair against the far wall so I could reach the top shelf of her wardrobe. I remember placing it deliberately, flush against the baseboard. I went to bed around 10. In the morning, the chair was in the center of the room, facing the window. I told myself I had moved it without thinking. People do things on autopilot. I put it back against the wall and kept working. The second morning it was in the center of the room again, facing the window. I stood in the doorway a long time. Outside the window there was only the tree line, the pines going dark green into shadow, nothing moving. I picked up the chair and carried it into the kitchen where I could see it from anywhere. That night I sat up reading and watched it. Nothing moved. I fell asleep in the other chair around 2. When I woke, the kitchen chair was still exactly where I had left it. But through the window out in the yard, something had arranged 6 of my aunt's dinner plates in a perfect circle in the dirt. They were face up, clean, like a table had been set for guests who had not yet arrived. I checked the front door. The lock was still turned from the inside. Our next story. The address came through at 11:48, which was later than I usually take rides, but it was a Tuesday and I needed the money. The pickup was on Felder Road, which I only half knew, a long 2-lane stretch between the reservoir and a row of old packing warehouses that nobody uses anymore. I figured someone had been visiting a friend out there, or maybe their car broke down. I pulled up to the pin and there was nobody. Just gravel on the shoulder, a chain-link fence, and the warehouses sitting dark behind it. I waited the standard 5 minutes, engine running, hazards on. A man appeared from between 2 of the buildings. He was maybe 50, wearing a gray jacket, carrying nothing. He got in the back and said thank you quietly and gave me the cross streets for his destination, which was a neighborhood about 12 minutes away. I started driving. He did not look at his phone. Most people look at their phones. I watched him in the mirror a few times, which you do, and he was just looking out the side window at the dark fields going past. About halfway there, I noticed the warehouse district came up on my left again. The same fence, the same long row of dark buildings. I had been driving in a straight line. I know that road, there is no loop. I almost said something, but I did not want to sound confused in front of a passenger. I kept driving and delivered him to his address. He thanked me again and walked up to the house and went inside. The app logged the ride as 4 minutes long. I had been driving for at least 15. When I looked up the address he had given me, the house had been vacant for 2 years. Our next story. The radio crackled at 2:40 in the morning, which was normal. What came through it was not. I was doing my 3rd hour in the lookout cab, eating cold rice from a Tupperware container and logging wind readings. Clear night, no smoke, nothing for miles but pine and rock. The radio on the shelf ran the standard Forest Service frequency, mostly static with the occasional check-in from dispatch down in Grants Pass. I barely registered it anymore. But this time it was breathing. Slow, measured, close to the microphone. I put down my fork and listened. 12 seconds, maybe 15, and then it stopped. I keyed up and asked dispatch if they had traffic on the line. A woman told me the frequency had been clear since midnight. I told myself it was feedback, some kind of blade from another band. I went back to my log. 20 minutes later the breathing came back, and underneath it, very quietly, someone was counting. Not frantically. Calmly, the way you count when you are keeping track of something. 7, 8, 9. Then silent. I stood up and looked out the glass on all 4 sides. The catwalk was empty. The forest below was perfectly still. The access road had 1 car on it, which was mine. I sat back down. My pen was missing from the table. I had set it right next to the log, and it was gone. I looked on the floor under the chair, along the shelf. I keyed up 1 more time and asked if anyone was reading me on this frequency. A voice I did not recognize said, "Yes, we have been reading you for a while now." The door at the base of the tower had been unlocked when I arrived, and I had assumed I left it that way. Our next story. I pulled into the Mineral Wells rest stop at 20 past 1, killed the engine, and started eating a cold sandwich I had packed somewhere outside of Abilene. The lot was empty except for a single white sedan parked under the far light, no plates I could see from where I sat. I did not think anything of it. People sleep in their cars. I was maybe 10 minutes into my break when I noticed the woman standing at the edge of the lot, right where the pavement meets the grass before the tree line. She was wearing a pale yellow dress and just standing there, facing the trees, not moving. I figured she needed some air, maybe had been driving too long. I understood that feeling. 5 minutes later I looked up again and she was standing at the middle of the lot, same posture, same direction, facing the trees. She had not turned around. I had not heard footsteps, had not seen her move. I told myself I had just stopped paying attention for a second. Then she was at the edge of my headlight, maybe 30 feet from the cab. Still facing away. The yellow of her dress was very bright under the light. I could see her shoulders were completely still, the way a person is still when they are not breathing. I started the engine. I am not ashamed to say that. I pulled out of that lot and got back on the highway without looking in my mirrors for about 4 miles. When I finally did look, there was nothing behind me but dark road. I checked my logbook this morning to confirm the stop. The time I wrote down was 1:22. I had been parked there for 40 minutes. Our next story. On the 2nd day of the storm, I watched a man walk across my backyard. The snow was up to the fence posts by then, maybe 2.5 feet, and nothing had moved out there since the birds stopped coming to the feeder the morning before. I was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, watching nothing, the way you do when you have been inside too long. He came from the left side of the yard, the side where the old shed is, and he walked in a straight line toward the tree line at the back. He was dressed in a dark coat. No hat. Moving at an even, unhurried pace. I remember thinking how strange it was that he was not struggling through the snow at all. No high-stepping, no floundering. He moved the way you would move across a parking lot. I set down the coffee and watched him reach the trees and disappear. I told myself it was a neighbor cutting through. People do that sometimes in the summer. I went back to my book, but after about an hour the thought came back, small and persistent, that I had not seen any footprints. Not in the snow, not on the other side of the glass. The yard had looked exactly the way it always looks in a storm. Smooth and untouched. I waited until the light got thin, and then I turned on the back porch light and looked out. The snow was unbroken all the way to the trees. I went to bed early. Woke up around 3 to get some water and stood for a moment in the dark kitchen and did not look out the window. I was afraid he would be standing there looking back at me. Our next story. My shoes were already soaking through when I cut across the Millbrook parking structure, the shortcut that saves me 8 minutes on the walk back from the diner. Third floor is always empty after 9. I know every oil stain on that concrete by now. There was a man standing at the far end, near the yellow barrier wall. Just standing there, facing out toward the street below. I figured he was on a call or drunk or both, so I kept my head down and moved toward the stairwell. He turned before I reached it. Not to look at me, just turned and walked to the center of the floor and stopped again. No phone. Both arms at his sides. He was wearing a gray coat and he was completely still in the way that people almost never are. No shifting weight, no fidgeting, just stopped. I took the stairs. On the second floor landing I slowed down because I could hear footsteps above me. Even unhurried, crossing the third floor toward the stairwell I had just left. I kept moving and came out onto the street, and I did not look back for the first half block because I told myself it was nothing, someone heading to their car, an obvious explanation. I looked back at the half-block mark. The entrance to the stairwell was lit by one yellow bulb and he was standing in it, at the bottom, watching me go. He had come down in the same amount of time it took me to cross half a block and descend 2 flights. I turned around and walked faster and did not stop until I was inside my building. The thing I keep returning to is that there were no cars on the 3rd floor tonight. Our next story. Room 4 had been empty since Tuesday, so I wrote it off as nothing when I caught the monitor light blinking through the window in the door. I was doing my 3 a.m. check on the ward, just me and one patient at the far end, a Mr. Callie recovering from a hip replacement. Everyone else had been discharged or moved to the surgical floor. The ward was so quiet I could hear the ice machine 2 hallways over, cycling through its little routine. The monitor in room 4 had no patient attached to it. There was no reason it should be reading anything. I pushed the door open and checked the screen out of habit, the way you do when a thing does not make immediate sense. The waveform was flat. Of course it was. I reached behind the unit and checked that it was properly powered down, confirmed that it was, and moved on. Equipment does odd things in the small hours. I have worked nights long enough to know that. I finished the round, wrote my notes at the station, and went to look in on Mr. Callie around 3:40. He was sleeping with his mouth open, one arm flung out, perfectly fine. I stood in his doorway for a moment just listening to him breathe. On my way back past room 4, the monitor light was on again. I went in. The screen was active this time, not flat, running a clean, steady waveform, 62 beats per minute, strong and regular. The leads were coiled on the mattress, connected to nothing. I stood there a long time. The number did not change. When I checked my own pulse at the wrist, it was 62. Our next story. The baby monitor showed both kids sleeping, so I settled into the couch with my phone and the last of the lemonade misses. Heller had left in the fridge. The house was one of those big quiet ones on the edge of a subdivision where the street lights stop. No neighbors visible from the back windows, just the dark yard and the tree line beyond it. I had done this job a dozen times and never thought much about it. Around 10, I noticed the yard light had come on. Motion activated, a white cone of it falling on the grass. I looked out and there was nothing there, no raccoon, no cat, just the light doing what motion lights do sometimes. I went back to my phone. It came on again 20 minutes later. I looked out. Same empty yard. I told myself the sensor was old or a branch had moved somewhere. The third time I looked out, there was a woman standing at the far edge of the yard, right where the light faded into dark. She was facing the house. She had on a long coat and her hair was down and she was completely still. She was too far back for me to make out her face, but she was the right shape for a person, entirely a person, just standing there in someone else's backyard at 10:30 at night. I sat there frozen for maybe 15 seconds, and then the light went off. When it came back on a moment later, the yard was empty. I called Mrs. Heller. She answered on the second ring and I described what I saw, trying to keep my voice steady. She was quiet for a second. Then she said that was the third time this month. Our next story. Rusty stopped walking at the corner of Fenn and Aldrich, just planted all four paws and refused to move. He does this sometimes, usually for squirrels or a scent he wants to investigate, so I gave the leash some slack and checked my phone. 4:47 in the morning. The street was the way it always is that early, which is to say completely empty, the sodium lights orange and humming, every house sealed up and dark. Then I noticed the man standing in the driveway of the Carver house. The Carvers moved out in August. I know because I watched the truck come. The house has been listed since then, vacant, a lockbox on the door and a realtor sign by the mailbox. But there was a man standing in the driveway, perfectly still, facing the garage. Not doing anything. Just standing. I told myself he was probably a contractor, someone scoping the place early, maybe the realtor himself. People keep odd hours. I know that better than anyone. Rusty would not move forward. He pressed back against my shins, which he has never done before in 4 years of walking him. I stood there maybe 2 minutes watching the man. He never shifted his weight or turned his head. The garage door was down. There was nothing to look at. I finally stepped off the curb to cross to the other side of the street, and when I did, I got a clear look at the driveway under the streetlight. There were no shoes on the pavement. There were no feet. The figure ended at the ankles, and below that there was only the concrete, and the concrete was dry, and nothing cast a shadow. I have not taken that route since. Rusty still waits by the leash hook every morning at 4:30, tail moving, ready to go. Our next story. The third-floor hallway smelled like floor wax and old lunch when I found the locker standing open. Not unusual on its own. Kids forget to spin the dial all the time. I swung it shut, gave it a bump with my palm, and kept pushing my cart toward the exit stairs. By the time I reached the stairwell door, I heard it open again behind me. I turned around. Locker 304, same one, hanging wide. The kind of wide where the door rests against its own hinges, like someone pushed it with intention. I walked back and checked the latch, which was fine, spun the combination a full turn, and pushed it harder this time. It clicked. I stood there a moment and listened to the building settle the way old schools do, all groaning pipes and nothing else. I was 2 floors down, mopping the gym hallway, when the intercom clicked on. The intercoms had been dead since the district cut the office budget in March. I knew that because I was the one who filed the maintenance request and never heard back. But the speaker above the trophy case gave one long, clear click, and then a sound came through that I can only describe as the last few seconds of a word, like the first part had been cut off. The shape of it was familiar. It took me longer than I want to admit to understand why. It was the shape of my name. Not a word that sounds like my name. My name. I stood there with the mop handle in both hands and did not move for a while. Then I finished the haul, clocked out, and drove home, and told myself the system had a short. The maintenance log already had an entry for it, dated 6 years before I was hired. Our next story. Floor 7 is where I always do my second round first, because the elevator is slow and the stairwell light on 6 flickers, and I had a system. I had been doing this job for 11 months. I knew that building the way you know a house you grew up in. So when I stepped off the elevator at 2:15 15 and saw the conference room light on, I assumed someone had left it burning after a late meeting. It happens. I walked down the hall, keys in my hand, and I pushed the door open. The chairs were all pulled out. Every single one of them angled slightly toward the head of the table, the way they look when a meeting has just ended and people have stood up at the same moment. There was a coffee cup at the head of the table with steam still rising from it. I told myself the cleaning crew had made coffee. I told myself someone had been working late and just stepped out. I even walked to the window and looked down at the parking lot to find the car that would explain it, and there was nothing down there but my own truck and the empty rows of asphalt under the yellow lights. I picked up the cup. It was hot enough that I had to set it back down. I finished the rest of my rounds and I did not go back to floor 7 until my next scheduled pass at 4:00. The light was off. The chairs were all pushed in, perfectly even, the way the cleaning crew leaves them. The cup was gone. I checked the visitor log the next morning before I clocked out. The building had been empty since 6:30 the previous evening. My badge was the only one scanned all night. Our next story. The fire had burned down to almost nothing when I noticed the lights moving through the tree line. Not flashlight. Flashlights swing, they arc, they bounce with whoever is carrying them. These stayed at a fixed height, maybe 8 feet off the ground, and they moved parallel to my campsite at a steady, unhurried pace. 3 of them spaced maybe 30 feet apart, a pale yellowish white, like the inside of a fluorescent tube. I sat up in my camp chair and watched. I told myself it was other campers, maybe on a trail I had not noticed, though I had hiked the whole perimeter that afternoon and found nothing. They stopped. All 3 at once, perfectly still, about 40 yards into the trees. I waited for them to move on. They did not. I started counting seconds just to give my brain something to do. I reached 60, then 120, then I stopped counting. The lights did not flicker or shift. They just held there in the dark between the pines, patient in a way that felt deliberate. I got up and unzipped the tent for my headlamp. It took me maybe 10 seconds. When I turned back around, the lights were gone. No movement, no fading out. Just gone the way a channel cuts to black. I did not sleep. I sat with the headlamp on until the sky went gray and the birds started. When I packed up and hiked out that morning, I stopped at the trailhead register to sign out. I flipped back through the pages to see who else had been in this section. The last entry before mine was dated 11 weeks ago. Our next story. Dispatch Console 3 had been quiet for 2 hours when the call came in, no voice on the line, just a low mechanical hum I recognized as an open cell connection. I logged it as a pocket dial and moved on. Same number called back 4 minutes later. Same hum, nothing else. I said the standard greeting twice, noted the silence, disconnected. The third call I almost let go to voicemail. But something made me pick up, and this time I heard breathing, very slow and even, the kind of breathing a person does when they are trying not to make noise. I ran the number. It traced to a payphone on Route 9 outside Henley, which I thought was strange because I was fairly sure Henley had no payphones anymore. I flagged it for a unit to check and logged the coordinates. About 20 minutes later, Deputy Mars called it in. He was at the location. There was a payphone, he said, freestanding on a gravel pull-off with no business or building nearby, just tree line. It was intact, not vandalized. The receiver was hanging off the hook. He ran the phone company tag on the back of the unit and called it in to me so I could check the registered line. The number it traced to was the same number that had called us. Mars laughed a little, said equipment does strange things. I wrote it up that way, equipment malfunction, and the shift ended and I went home and slept fine. I only thought about it again last week, when I pulled up the original call log to cross-reference something unrelated. The duration on the first call, the one I wrote off as a pocket dial before anyone had answered, was 9 minutes and 40 seconds. Our next story. Nobody checked in after 10, so the parking lot was always mine. I used to walk it on slow nights, just to move my legs, maybe 2 or 3 slow laps between the ice machine and the dumpster enclosure at the far end. The property sat off a county road in the middle of nowhere, and on clear nights you could see a long way in every direction. Flat scrubland, a water tower with a blinking red light, nothing else. That Thursday I was on my 3rd lap when I noticed a car parked in the far corner of the lot. Not in a space. Tucked against the fence line, nose toward the road, like it had been eased in quietly. A white sedan with no plates. I had not heard it pull in. My chair faced the window, and I had been at the desk less than 20 minutes before. I stood and watched it for a moment. No interior light, no exhaust, no movement. I wrote down the make and went back inside. Around 2, I looked out, and a man was standing beside the car. Just standing there with his hands at his sides, facing the motel. The lot was bright enough that I could make out a collared shirt, dark pants. He looked like someone waiting for a bus. I picked up the phone and watched him while I waited for the non-emergency line to answer. By the time someone picked up, he was gone. The car was still there. I described it, they said they would send someone out, and I thanked them and hung up. The cruiser arrived around 2:40, and the deputy walked the lot and came inside and told me the car had no plates because it had no plates on the back either, and no VIN on the dash. He said the front seat was warm. Our next story. The scratching started at 11:15, which I figured was my neighbor in 4B dragging furniture around. He did that sometimes. I had seen him in the hall once, older man, very quiet, always wearing the same brown cardigan. Moving things around at night seemed to fit him somehow. I turned my TV up a little and forgot about it. Then I heard the chair. One chair pulled slow across hardwood and then set down. That distinct 4-legged tap when something lands. I knew that sound because my own floors were the same. After the chair came the voice. Low and continuous, not a phone call, not the television. More like someone reading aloud to themselves. I pressed my ear against the wall without really deciding to. The words were too muffled to catch, but the rhythm was steady, almost careful, like a person reciting something they had memorized a long time ago. It stopped around midnight. I went to bed. In the morning I mentioned it to the building super when I passed him checking the mail slots. Just making conversation, something about the man in 4B being up late. The super looked up from his clipboard. He told me 4B had been vacant since March. Lease ended, fellow moved out, unit was still listed for showing. He said it like it was nothing, flipping back to his papers. I said the man in the brown cardigan, and the super nodded slowly. He said yes, that was Mr. Hale, the previous tenant, that was him. I stood there in the lobby for a moment and then asked if Mr. Hale had moved somewhere else in the building. The super looked at me and said Mr. Hale had passed away in March. Our next story. Sawdust was still settling when I noticed the barn door had closed. I had propped it open myself not 20 minutes before, wedged a cinder block against the base because the hinges were warped and the thing fought you every time you touched it. I was pulling old lath off the kitchen wall when I looked through the window and saw it standing shut, and my first thought was wind, just whined, even though the afternoon was completely still. I walked out to check. The cinder block was sitting 3 feet away from the door, upright, not tipped over like it had been kicked. Set down deliberately, the way you would set something down when your hands were full. I told myself it must have rolled. Cinder blocks do not roll, but I told myself that anyway. I went back inside and kept working. An hour passed. I was on my knees prying up a section of subfloor when I heard the barn door drag open again, that specific grinding complaint of the warped hinges I had already heard 100 times that week. I went to the window. The door was open. The cinder block was back in position against the base. Nobody was in the yard. The gravel driveway was empty all the way down to the county road. The tree line at the back of the property was just trees, nothing moving in them. I stood there for a long time doing the math on whether I had imagined the whole thing. I decided I had not imagined it. I got in my truck and sat there until the sun was almost gone, and then I drove to the motel in town. When I pulled out, my rear view caught the barn door, already swinging closed again. Our next story. My line had been sitting still for 40 minutes when the light appeared on the other side of the lake. Not a flashlight. Too steady for that and too low to the water, maybe 6 inches above the surface. It was the size of a tennis ball, pale white, and it just sat there. I figured someone had anchored a small boat over there and left a lantern running. The reservoir is maybe a quarter-mile wide at that point, so I could not make out much detail. I watched it for a while, then went back to watching my bobber. About 20 minutes later, I looked up again, and the light had moved. It was closer to the center now, still that same steady pale glow. No boat that I could hear. Sound carries perfectly well over water at 3 in the morning, and I heard nothing but frogs and my own breathing. I told myself it was swamp gas or some kind of phosphorescent bloom. I had read about that once. I started believing it mostly. Then it stopped moving and a second light appeared next to it. Same size, same color, same height off the water. They sat beside each other for a long moment, perfectly still. I set my rod down without really deciding to. The 2 lights began moving again, slowly, in a wide arc along the far bank. They stayed exactly the same distance apart, like they were attached to something, the way headlights are attached to a car. But there was no road over there. There had never been a road over there. I grew up 2 miles from that reservoir, and I knew every inch of the bank. They came to a stop directly across from me. Then the frogs went quiet. Our next story. A man pulled up to pump 3 around 2:30, and I watched him on the monitor the way you do, not suspicious, just habit. He got out, swiped his card, lifted the nozzle. Normal. But he stood there for a long time without squeezing the handle, just looking out at the road. I figured he was tired. Long-haul drivers do that sometimes, just stand in the night air and breathe. Then I noticed the pump was running. The numbers were climbing on the display, gallons ticking up, but his hand was at his side, and the nozzle was back in the cradle. I watched the monitor again to make sure I was seeing it right. The nozzle was definitely in the cradle. The pump was definitely running. I picked up the intercom and said something like, "Sir, I think there might be an issue with pump 3. He turned and looked directly at the camera. Not at the intercom speaker, not at the store window. At the camera, which is mounted up on the canopy corner, and not obvious unless you know where it is. He held up one hand, palm out, like he was telling me to wait. I almost called my manager right then, but I talked myself out of it, the way you do. Equipment glitches. Strange people make strange gestures. It was late and I was tired, and the world gets weird at 2 a.m. He got back in the car. He drove away. The pump stopped exactly when his taillights disappeared, and the total on the display reads 0, like the transaction had never happened. I checked the receipt log this morning, and pump 3 had no activity recorded after midnight. But the security footage was 17 minutes shorter than it should have been. Our next story. Box 12 on my route sits at the end of a gravel road outside Pryor Creek, and I had been driving that stretch for 2 years without any trouble. The nearest neighbor is 3 miles back. You get used to the quiet out there, the way your headlights are the only moving light for as far as you can see. I pulled up to the property at a little after 1 in the morning and sat a moment with the engine running, like I always did, just checking the porch. The package was a small one, medical supply by the label. I grabbed it, walked up the steps, and set it against the door. That was when I noticed the light in the field. Not a flashlight, not a phone screen. More like a lamp, the warm kind, sitting maybe 100 yards out in a fallow cornfield with no cord and no house anywhere near it. Just sitting there on the ground, glowing steady. I stood on that porch longer than I should have, telling myself it was a deer hunter, a camper, somebody with a lantern. But the light did not move. It just held still in the dark, and no shape stood around it. No shadow suggested a person nearby. Then it went out. I walked back to the van, got in, and pulled a slow three-point turn so my headlights swept across that field. There was nothing there. No lamp. No person. Not even a flattened ring in the old stalks to show where something had rested. I finished my route and wrote it off as some kind of equipment left behind by a surveyor or a farmer. That was 6 months ago. The name on box 12 changed last week, and the new name is mine. Our next story. The curtains in the back bedroom were open when I arrived, and I was certain I had closed them the night before. I was 3 days into a 2-week house sit in a place called Delwood, looking after a cat and a succulent collection for a couple I found through a mutual friend. Nice house, older neighborhood, the kind of street where the trees have grown tall enough to block the streetlights. I had a routine down already. Check the cat, water the plants, lock the back door, close the curtains because the neighbor's motion light threw a beam straight into that room and woke me up the first night. I had closed them. I remembered doing it. I opened them to look outside, figuring maybe the cat had pulled them, and across the narrow side yard I could see the neighbor's house. A single window lit from inside. A woman standing at it, facing my direction. Nothing unusual about that, except she was completely still. Not looking at her phone, not doing dishes. Just standing. I let the curtains fall and went to make tea. When I came back 20 minutes later, the light was off. I told myself she had gone to bed. I told myself the curtains were something I had only thought I remembered closing. I sat on the couch with the cat and watched something I barely registered on the owner's laptop, and eventually I fell asleep there. In the morning, the owner's welcome binder was open on the kitchen counter. I had not opened it since the first evening. The page it was sitting on said the house on the left had been vacant for 11 months. Our next story. Grandma's hall closet had been sorted, bagged, and labeled by noon, which felt like progress until I found the back bedroom. She had lived alone for 11 years after my grandfather died, and the room still held his side of things. Flannel shirts on hangers. A pair of reading glasses folded on the nightstand. A coffee mug with a faded Cardinals logo that I could not bring myself to move yet. I worked slowly, setting each item in one of 3 piles, and the afternoon got quiet the way old houses do. Around 4, I heard the television come on. I stopped. There was no television in the back bedroom. The only one in the house sat in the living room at the end of the hall, an old tube set we had not plugged in since arriving. I assumed I had bumped something, or that the sound was drifting from outside. I kept working. It came on again 10 minutes later. Same low murmur, same room. I walked down the hall and looked at the set. The cord was coiled on the floor behind it, not plugged into anything. I told myself old houses settle, old wiring does strange things, and I went back to sorting. Then I heard the mug. Not breaking. Not falling. The small clean sound of ceramic lifted and set back down, careful and deliberate, the exact sound a person makes when they do not want to wake someone sleeping nearby. I stood in the doorway of the back bedroom and looked at the nightstand. The mug was on the other side of where I had placed it, closer to the left side of the bed. His side. Our next story. She was already standing at the curb when I turned onto Bleecker, which was strange because the app showed her pickup point as the empty lot beside the grain elevator, not the road. I slowed down anyway. She got in without saying anything, just gave me a small nod in the mirror, and I pulled back toward the highway. The fare was out to a place called Holt Junction, about 19 miles east, which I had never heard of. No cell signal past mile marker 8, so I was running on the navigation screenshot I had taken before I lost service. Dark road, flat fields on both sides, the kind of drive where your headlights feel like they only reach about 10 feet in front of you. She did not speak the entire ride. I am used to that. I turned the heat fan down a little and just drove. About a mile before the Holt Junction turnoff, I saw a figure standing in the road. Male, I thought, dark coat, standing completely still in the center of my lane. I braked hard, came to a stop maybe 30 feet from him. He did not move. I flicked my high beams twice. Nothing. I looked down at my phone to hit the hazard button, and when I looked back up, he was gone. I sat there for a few seconds, scanning the fields on both sides. Nothing. I said something like, "Did you see that?" and glanced in the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. The door had not opened. I had not felt her leave. I drove the last mile alone and sat in the Holt Junction lot for probably 20 minutes before I could make myself check the app. The ride had never been accepted. Our next story. Halfway through my log entry for the 11 o'clock scan, I noticed the boat. It was sitting about a quarter mile out, no running lights, no anchor lamp, just a dark hull sitting flat on the water. September on Lake Superior, clear sky, and this vessel was running completely dark. I noted it in the log, time-stamped it, and went back to my sweep. Probably somebody with a dead battery. That was my first thought, and I held onto it longer than I should have. Around midnight, I looked again. The boat had not moved, which was odd, because there was enough wind that night to push an unanchored hull. I got the binoculars out and pointed them at the water for a long time. I could not make out anyone on deck, no movement at all. The hull looked like a small cabin cruiser, maybe 30 feet. I wrote that down too. At 12:30, I went to make coffee, and when I came back to the lamp room, the boat was gone. No lights moving away from shore, no wake line catching the beam on the outswing. Just open water where it had been. I swept 3 more times and logged that it had departed. In the morning, the relief volunteer, a retired teacher named Gerald, came up the stairs with a thermos and a newspaper folded under his arm. He asked how the night was, routine question, and I told him about the dark boat. He set his thermos down and looked at me the way people look when they are choosing their words. He said a boat went down in that exact stretch 40 years ago this week, and they never recovered the hull. Our next story. Somewhere around mile marker 40, I had decided on the rest stop near Elkhart, and pulling in I noticed a car already parked under the far light, engine off, no movement inside. Normal enough. People sleep in their cars. I grabbed my coffee thermos and walked to the concrete picnic tables near the vending machines, just to stretch my legs for 20 minutes before the long push to Indianapolis. The car was a white sedan, maybe a Civic, maybe 10 years old. Something about it caught my eye, and I kept glancing over while I drank my coffee. After a few minutes, I realized what it was. The car was on, the engine running, but the headlights were off, and I had not heard it start. I was almost certain it had been off when I parked. A man got out of the driver's side. Middle-aged, tan jacket, moving like someone who had just woken up. He walked to the restrooms without looking at me, and I went back to my thermos. When he came back out, he walked straight to my table and sat down across from me. Not nearby, not at the next table over. Directly across from me, like we had agreed to meet there. He said my name, my actual first name, and then he said, "You should get moving. Traffic clears up around Gary if you leave in the next 10 minutes. I did not answer him. I just stared. He got up, walked back to the sedan, and drove out of the lot heading east. I have no idea how he knew my name or my route. I have been trying to figure that out for 8 months. What I cannot figure out is why there were no brake lights when he pulled onto the highway. Our next story. Every window on the north side had been dark for 3 days, the neighbor's house sitting quiet under maybe 4 feet of snow, and I had stopped looking at it out of boredom more than anything else. So I almost missed the footprints. They started at the far tree line, single file, and came across the yard in a straight line toward the front door of that house. My first thought was that Doug had come home early from his daughter's place, which was where he said he'd be for the whole storm. I texted him. He said he was still there, had been there since Thursday, wasn't planning on leaving until the plows came through. I went back to the window. The footprints were still there, one set going in, none coming out. I told myself an animal could leave prints that looked like that from a distance. 4 feet of snow distorts everything. I actually said that out loud to myself in my kitchen. Then a light moved through the back bedroom of his house. Not a lamp turning on, not an overhead light. Something handheld crossing the room slow and then stopping. It stayed in the same spot for a long time. Long enough that I made a full pot of coffee and came back and it was still there. I called the non-emergency line and a woman told me a unit would come by when roads were passable, probably tomorrow, and to stay inside. The light went out around midnight. In the morning, I looked out before I did anything else. The footprints on Doug's side were gone, smoothed over, the snow in his yard completely undisturbed. We had gotten no new snow overnight. Our next story. Halfway across the pedestrian bridge on Corrigan Ave, I stopped to adjust the strap on my backpack, and that is when I noticed the man standing in the dry creek bed below. He was just standing there. Not moving, not looking at anything I could see, just standing with his arms loose at his sides in about 3 inches of muddy water. It was past midnight and the nearest streetlight was back at the road, so I could only make out his shape, a dark shape in a dark place, but he was definitely a person. I figured he was drunk. I figured he had stumbled down there somehow and was too disoriented to climb back up the bank. I called down and asked if he was okay. He did not move. He did not look up. I watched for another few seconds, then I pulled out my phone to see if I had enough signal to call someone. When I looked back down, he had turned to face the bridge. He was looking directly up at me now, and the thing that made my stomach go tight was that I could hear him. He was talking quietly, just barely audible over the water, and the cadence of it was completely even, like someone reading from a list. I started walking. I did not run, I just walked fast, because I needed to believe this was nothing. I was almost to the far end of the bridge when I heard it clearly. He said my name. Not a version of my name, not a shout in my direction. He said my full name, first and last, in that same quiet reading voice, and then continued whatever he had been saying before, as though my name was just one more item on the list. I had never seen that man before in my life. Our next story. Gerald in bed 7 had been asleep since 8, and the ward had that particular quiet I actually liked, just the low hum of the monitors and the fluorescent above the nurse's station that buzzed faintly on one note. I was charting my midnight vitals when I noticed the call light for bed 3 was on. Bed 3 was empty. Had been empty since the transfer that afternoon. I walked down and clicked it off. The room was dark except for the parking lot glow through the blinds. Nobody in the bed, nobody near the wall panel. I assumed a cleaning cart had bumped the button, went back to my station. 15 minutes later it was on again. I stood in the doorway this time and looked harder. The bed was still stripped down to the mattress, the pillow folded at the foot the way housekeeping always leaves them. The call button cord was looped over the side rail, the way it should be when no patient is present, not hanging down where someone could press it, coiled up on top of the rail. I stood there long enough to feel slightly foolish, and then turned it off again. I asked Karen from the overnight desk to come sit at the station while I did a slow walk of the whole ward. Gerald was asleep. The 2 patients in 5 and 6 were asleep. The supply closet was locked. Nothing. I went back to charting. I did not look at bed 3 again until the morning team came on. The day nurse was making her first round and stopped in the doorway of bed 3 and called back to me. She asked who had signed out the extra pillow. The bed had only one. Our next story. The faucet in the upstairs bathroom had been dripping for about an hour, steady enough that I had tuned it out completely. I was on the couch with a textbook, the kind of quiet babysitting job where you almost feel guilty taking the money. The Harrisons lived out past the county line, no neighbors visible from any window, and both kids had gone down without a fuss by 7:30. I heard the dripping stop. Not slow down, just stop, the way a faucet stops when someone turns the handle. I sat there for a moment, listening. The house made its usual sounds. I told myself the pressure had just equalized, that pipes do things on their own, and I went back to reading. Then I heard footsteps cross the bathroom floor above me. Small, unhurried ones, 4 or 5 steps, then nothing. I went upstairs. Both bedroom doors were closed. I opened the first one and Maya was in her bed, completely still, blanket pulled to her chin. I opened the second one and Corey was the same. I checked the bathroom and the faucet was off and dry, the floor dry, the towels undisturbed. I stood in the hallway for a long moment and felt genuinely foolish. I went back downstairs, got myself a glass of water, and sat back down. Around 9, I heard Mrs. Harrison's car in the driveway. She came in, paid me, asked if everything had gone okay. I almost mentioned the footsteps, but decided not to. She walked me to the door and I was already on the porch when she said, quietly, mostly to herself, that she needed to fix that bathroom faucet before the kids started using it again. I turned around, but she had already closed the door. Our next story. Pepper pulled hard toward the far end of Oleander Court, which she never did, and I let her lead because at 4 in the morning there is nothing else to do. The houses on that end were all dark, the way they always are, porch light on the Garcias, blue recycling bins lined up for Tuesday. Everything ordinary. Pepper stopped at the cul-de-sac and sat, which is not a thing she does on walks, and stared at the empty lot between the Haverson house and the wooden fence at the back of the development. There was a man standing in that lot. He was facing away from me, just standing in the weeds, and I thought, neighbor, can't sleep, maybe he smokes out here. I gave him a wide berth and circled back toward the sidewalk. Pepper would not move. I had to tug twice before she followed, and even then she kept turning to look back at him. I finished the loop and came around the block from the other side, the way the route naturally goes, and when I passed the opening of the cul-de-sac again, I looked down toward the lot. He was still there. Same spot. Still facing away. I checked my phone, noted the time out of habit, 4:22, and walked faster. Back at the car, I sat for a minute with the heat running. I told myself the man lived in the neighborhood, was allowed to stand in a vacant lot, that people are strange, and that is all. I mentioned it to my client when I dropped Pepper off. She looked at me for a moment and said that lot has been fenced off since August. There is no way in.